Welcome, listeners, to the Religious Studies Project. It's the 11th of June. I'm speaking to you from the past, and I am and I'm Chris Carter.
Beyond the grave.
And that is the ghost of Dr. David Robertson on the other side of the table. We're getting giddy because the weather's been so good lately, and it's, all that we're not used to that extra vitamin D in Scotland.
I look healthy for the first time in 6 months. We've got some fresh green in our diet.
Exactly. It's wonderful. It's really good for the spirit, which,
You're
outside,
this is great.
Outside of a religious framework, you could say that everyone is spiritual in some way, aren't they?
Well, I find there's a lot of nature outside just now, and I find nature very nourishing to the spirit.
On that note, there's a reason that we're being facetious. We have an excellent interview for you here. It's more of a three-way conversation than an interview, perhaps. It's between Boaz Huss, Steve Sutcliffe, and the guy sitting opposite me, David Robertson. And they're talking about this quite sort of amorphous, nebulous, contested term, spirituality, what scholars can do with it, what happens with it out there in the meat world and in the spirit world. So take it away, David, Steve, and Boaz.
Spirituality is a term with enormous currency in contemporary discourse and religion. But despite this, it remains under-theorized. Little consideration is given to its development, and most scholarly work simply dismisses it as shallow and commercialized. To discuss spirituality, I'm joined today by Boaz Huss, a professor of Jewish thought at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and also by Steve Sutcliffe, who is senior lecturer here at Religious Studies in the University of Edinburgh, where we're speaking today. So we thought we could maybe start then by setting out a little of, setting out the stall. Tell us about spirituality, and particularly the way it emerges as an identifier during the kind of New Age and the post-war period.
Okay, well, I could start and say something about that, but it's very good to have Boaz here to join in the discussion. So welcome to Boaz.
Yes.
Well, I suppose I came across spirituality and became, pretty much convinced of its significance as a cultural category when I was researching the so-called New Age movement. And in work that I did on that, I came to the conclusion that there wasn't a very strong movement that we could call New Age. There was a term, New Age, which was mobilized in a whole series of networks. But then increasingly what scholars were calling the New Age movement after the 1970s was better understood as a network of people whose preferred term was becoming spirituality, sometimes qualified by, mind, body, spirit, spirituality, sometimes holistic spirituality, often just spirituality. And this kind of shift seems to have been happening particularly, I would say, since after the 1960s, although the post-war period is important as well. But of course, there's also a very complicated and lengthy genealogy of the term emerging in a number of different groups as well. So it's a very complex but lively cultural category about which we still know very little, I think.
And what are some of the sort of themes and motifs then that we can pick out in this discourse in spirituality?
Right.
The various other terms.
Yeah. Well, I think, Boaz will have his own ideas here. For me, I've been interested in how it is often a kind of signifier for a form of what we might call vitalism in some ways. There's something more bubbling away in social life and beyond social life that the old category religion for users doesn't actually adequately tackle. Spirituality bit more nebulous, bit more amorphous, but actually does quite a good job through that nebulosity and amorphousness in pointing to something that people feel, there's something more going on here. Things have got more life to them. They've got more energy. There's something else going on. So that's been the route which I've been interested in the term, why people are using it to point to this feeling that there's something more going on in life.
And maybe you can turn to Boaz then. How does this? There's a shift there, right? When spirituality starts to get picked up by the New Age movement, it changes its meaning. It's not a new term, but it takes on a new set of connotations.
Yes, definitely. I think very similar to Stephen. I was very much impressed by the prominent presence of spirituality as a term in contemporary New Age movements, which I was working on in Israel, contemporary Kabbalistic movements and other. And I think actually also amongst my friends as a term that's very much alive and very much easily used by people to define themselves. Now, what for me was striking, maybe because I'm a historian and I started my work working on medieval Judaism and religions and early modern, is this really significant shift of meaning in spirituality, because spirituality has a very long term. Actually, it comes from a biblical term, very prominent, signifying the spirit, in contrast to the body, to the materiality, corporeality. And it played a very important role in medieval Christian theology, in translation also in Jewish theology. And it seemed to me that the use today is very different. And actually, I think the two main centers of the use of the term in early modern period changed. One is the juxtaposition of spirituality to corporeality and materiality, which was very central. And today, many people use the term spiritual, applying it to corporal, material things. Yes, yoga, sports, martial arts, healing, etc. And the other thing was the detachment from religion, because spirituality was considered the core of religion, related part of religion, and really the core of Christianity and religion. And today, I think the term that caught my attention was spiritual but not religious, which I think people tend to dismiss it. Some, a lot of people use it, but I think some scholars at least dismiss this notion. They're saying it, yes. But actually they are religious or secular. But I think we should take it very seriously that people choose to define secularity in opposition to the term that spirituality came from, and that is religious.
Except, yes, as well as the spiritual but not religious, you are seeing very recently, in the last 10 years or so, the church is making a kind of reclaiming of that, and you'll see spiritual and religious pop up. Yeah, so it's not so much that, from the point of view of these religious practitioners, spirituality is still the concept, with religion being part of that. So it's shifting in different ways, even in the last few years.
Well, it's a very user-friendly concept, isn't it? And it's also a multifunctional concept, I think. So the user-friendliness is that it's got a warmth and a vitality to it, I think, that religion doesn't have. And religion, in popular parlance, has been demonized, in a sense, stereotyped as this kind of oppressive institutional force. You often hear the term, institutional religion, which is juxtaposed to a kind of free-floating spirituality, something like that. So it's a kind of attractive word for people, but it's also multifunctional, I think, and it does various things at different levels for different audiences. And I think for the folks who might have been involved in New Age and related networks, it fulfills that function of a fairly freewheeling, personal, networked approach and discourse. But it's also being picked up, and this is interesting as well, I think it's also being picked up in sort of government policy educational, health circles. So we have here in the UK, as you probably know, Boaz, we've got spiritual chaplains now in NHS hospitals. We have spirituality as a kind of a perennial, all-encompassing term in interfaith circles. We have various think tanks exploring, the meaning of spirituality in cultural life. And so it's a term. These uses of a term are not all doing the same thing. Sometimes they're camouflaging various positions behind them. They're ways of putting new pawns on the chessboard to advance rather concealed courses. And other times they're much more grassroots, naive in their use.
And it reminds me of the way that interfaith is often used with a rather sort of ecumenical agenda behind it. That we might as well all team up in order to promote religion in the public sphere. And spirituality is another way of doing that, of course, because if you accept that, okay, maybe religions don't have a place, but spirituality does. And so who should we get to speak for spirituality? Let's get somebody from the Church of England.
I think that shows the power of the cultural power of this term that is adopted. Now, what's interesting is the people related to churches, they don't go back to Loyola's spiritual practices. They adopt spirituality from its modern unchurched use, and it comes together. It enters the churches with yoga, with Tai Chi classes, with other New Age. So I see that as part of really the language of New Age and spirituality. Also entering new places, and you said also, of course, medicine, government, business. Business is very strong. So I think that shows really this powerful and somehow the relevance. It's a good term for people today. If not, they wouldn't use it. There's something very, I think, serious and significant about it. And I think this tendency of some scholars, to dismiss it, it's really, not looking at something very interesting is going around us.
I mean, that might be an opportunity. Some of the scholars, two books come to mind that have been very, very critical, often in a slightly polemical way about this, which is Kimberly Lau's book, New Age Capitalism, and then also Jeremy Currett and Richard King's book, Selling Spirituality. Now, both of those books, have got a similar purpose. Kimberly Lau works out quite a sophisticated account of ideology and how spirituality is an ideology in her book, but she's still got this kind of criticism. In the case of Jeremy Currett and Richard King's book, it seems to be more about a slightly nostalgic reach back to pure, authentic, good old religion, as opposed to this sort of rather nasty sort of. However, what I was going to say is, if it is a multifunctional term, there is one angle of it. It seems to me in which the Currett and King and Lau critique is correct. In that in businesses, we just mentioned it. There can be a sense in which spirituality is a way of producing a happier workforce, a more comfortable workforce, a more productive workforce. But that doesn't seem to me to be the whole of the picture. So that was what I was saying about how it's a multifunctional kind of discourse, so that it's sort of layered or stacked with different kinds of uses and goals.
I think an important aspect of it to take in parallel with that sort of neoliberal critique is the Jungian kind of psychological idea. And those aren't separate, but you see the growth of sort of psychological and Jungian ideas in the business sphere, particularly because it's, the Marxist critique is that by treating the mental health issues that arise because of neoliberalism, that it allows neoliberalism to continue as an economic model. But of course, that's also the foundational model of large parts of the New Age milieu. This sense of the self and about the purpose of life being to develop the self, which is as well maybe points to how some of this blurring between the idea of the spirit as something not the body but simultaneously also the body.
That reminds me a bit of Paul Helas's work on self-spirituality or self-religion that he was developing a while ago, where, I mean, he's been critiqued by Matthew Wood and others for having a rather social model of the self, which I think is right. But nevertheless, he was pointing in some of his early work to, I think, one of these telephone marketing companies who were working with the idea that, you know, if you were in touch with your true whole self when you're at work, you would get better business results in your cold calling of people. You know, if you're doing that, you know, present in yourself, that would have an impact.
With
and
authenticity.
You would be, yes, and you would be at cause and not at effect, which is what happens if you were not in touch with yourself, you were just acted upon. So there seems to be something about, you know, being in touch with the self as an important part of the ideology of spirituality. Whether that comes through practice is another thing.
Yeah, may I want to go back to this point of neoliberalism, because I think it's important, because I think definitely the recognition that there is a connection is true. I think it emerges neoliberal ideology and postmodern culture and post-capitalistic global economics. They all, and spirituality emerge at the same period, and sometimes there's an overlap between the social composition of the people who are involved. Yeah. But I think the fact that there are similarities and there's interconnection between doesn't mean that spirituality is a disguised neoliberal ideology. It can be also a response sometimes to neo. Okay. So from that point of view, I think the connection is definitely there. And as I suggested, you know, we can look at spirituality as a kind of a postmodern new cultural formation and new age also. But that doesn't mean that it identifies with other postmodern cultural formations. And again, sometimes it is. I think on the one hand, you can show points in which it strengthens neoliberal ideology, but also other points or other groups. We have so many variety in this, spirituality as a new age that is a response and even trying to undermine. But still, again, what I see in it something very relevant. And, you know, we live in a postmodern, late capitalistic society. The cultural formation we use, and I think all of us are part of them to a certain degree, you know, there are those who are relevant to our society, and of course they're interconnected. So this nostalgia that you mentioned, I think it's not relevant to criticize spirituality. I don't see my role as a scholar to give marks or grade religious or spiritual. But to try to understand the function.
Because of course, I mean, the church is in this sort of early 20th century or earlier kind of in the earlier economic systems with the nation state and these kind of things. There are examples of institutional religion working with the state and working against the state then, and there are examples of New Age and spirituality working with the state and against the state now. It's no different. But of course, if you're looking at it from a nostalgic point of view, where this pre-modern modern organization of the state, and you're looking for things that look like the church you grew up in, then maybe you are going to come to that conclusion.
Yeah, in terms of that kind of countercultural impetus, I think Paul Helas talks about what he most recently calls new age spiritualities of life. He says it's something like a gentle counterflow or something like that. He's kind of not sort of going full on for the kind of countercultural stances of the 60s, but, you know, he's saying there is some kind of modest critique here in the stuff he's looking at. And sort of connected with that was the data for the Kendall project, you know, the Spiritual Revolution book that Paul did with Linda Woodhead. And there, we did quite a lot of valuable data. And I mean, now it's a little bit old, perhaps the early 2000s it was. But there was clearly a correlation between the folks participating in the holistic milieu in Kendall and environmental, ecological, green values. And there was also a correlation when asked in the various questionnaires and interviews with left of centre political attitudes as well. So I go, this is some way towards saying here's one small body of evidence that bears out what you're saying, Boaz, you know, that it's not only a question of being subsumed by sort of neoliberal positions. There is sort of agency here in a more political in a small p.
But this language is also taken up wholesale amongst the sort of the new right and the sort of conspiracy milieu that I look at. I mean, when I was down looking at, so most of the case studies I looked at actually were more left-leaning, but certainly in the right wing. It's a little bit blurred because we tend to focus on US data, and of course the US data is strongly identifies as Christian. But if you look at the right outside of the US, there's a strong association with spirituality, and you can find, for example, Red Ice radio podcast and now TV show out of Sweden started off doing very much kind of New Age and healing kind of stuff, and have gradually moved over until they're now just completely right-wing, pagan identifying. But you can see in the space of a few years there, as they make that shift, you still have language of spirituality and higher purpose and all these kind of things. And focus on health practices, all of these things are still there. So that, that discourse is not restricted to the left at all.
A few years ago, we had a project on the politics of the New Age. Actually, my interest in spirituality started from that project. And again, became very clear, first of all, that in difference than the self-declaration of many spiritualists and New Agers, we're not interested in politics. They are involved in politics, but you can find the combination. You can find New Age practices and use of spiritual terminology in the extreme right, religious national right in Israel, and of course what you would more expect in the left and green movements, etc. So it really is applied, I think again showing that it's a key cultural concept if it can be used, and by very different political and ideological agendas. And I think it's interesting. And actually, I think the use is quite similar. It's not that they just use it as each one gives it a completely different. They integrate it in very different ideologies. But the practices themselves, you go and, I don't know, do some kind of violent political act in the evening. In the morning, you grow organic veg and do meditation practices, etc., and connect with the nature around you. That's,
and lots of food. Like eating probiotic and vegetarian diets and all this stuff. It's right across the board.
It's very interesting, the use of the New Age terminology to justify, for instance, violence. That's natural. Part of the extreme right movements in Israel will say revenge is something very basic. And because of that, we can do, revenge acts, because that's part of, going back to nature, connecting with the earth. It's amazing to see this combination.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
And so that raises a question. I mean, it sounds to me that you're saying that spirituality as a concept has travelled very well in Israel, for example, in non-Christian context, because it's often seemed to me that there are some kind of affinities with a kind of post-Christian culture and the spirituality discourse, but it seems clear, even if that's the case, that it can acculturate elsewhere quite happily.
Yes.
So there's no problem with secular Jews, religious Jews, all kinds of folk picking up the term in the Israeli context.
I think it will be all across the board, but I think you will find some kind of American West connection, even in because some of the ultra-Orthodox movements, many of the people, of the members, are actually, returnee to religion. So actually they have that, that background or acquaintance. But I think on the other hand, it's so available and present here that even if you grew in an ultra-Orthodox family, you can it's available. This terminology and the practices are there, so they're easily reached.
Right.
And I believe it's similar in at least in westernized and middle class populations, also in other non-Christian cultures. I think in Turkey, Indonesia, Morocco, you will find again language of spirituality and definitely the New Age practices.
Yeah, I think that,
Very interesting.
And in
look at
in Asia as well, in Japan,
Japan,
China,
definitely, yes.
So you actually mentioned something about this, Boaz, in one of the papers I read, about how this was essentially swapping a sort of dualistic Western model for a Eastern monistic model. And I wonder if actually that would indicate that this would have quite a lot of currency in Asian countries, because it kind of maps much better than the imported model of religion and spirituality.
I'm not sure how it goes. This is the pizza effect, of coming, receiving back Indian meditation practices after they were westernized and then incorporating them back. Similar things with Kabbalah, for instance, having this new Kabbalah and then integrated. So there is some kind of coming back, but I think I would be hesitant to say that, there's something, definitely many of the practices were borrowed from non-Christian cultures, but to say that they're more open to them because of that, I would put more emphasis on the globalization.
I haven't made myself very clear. Okay, so what I mean is that the model of talking about spirituality rather than talking about religion and the secular would make more sense in an Asian country where they were never things that were separate to start with. So if you're going to import a Western construct, then spirituality works better than religion and the secular.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's clearer. Yeah. But I mean, so what is it? It starts to sound. I mean, I'm not convinced that there is one discourse. There are sevevel different, I think, layered and stacked discourses, but they probably share something in common. What is it they share in common, and why is this? Why are these discourses so attractive? What are they doing? What kind of empowerment or status or capital are they giving people? Do you have any developed thoughts on this, Boaz? What's the attraction?
Not to the.
Right. Yes. This is $1 million question.
There's something. Yes. But again, I think some of the emphasis of the New Age practices and this concept of spirituality are really in line with contemporary ideologies, ways of living.
Yeah, sure. That's right.
As I suggested, I think that this, and as you just said, the strict separation between religious and secular had its role, in modernity, and it seems it doesn't have that role. And then people can, use something new, which again, I don't want to say it's a new way of going back to religion, because I think it's something different, but really having a position which they don't have to define themselves as secular or religious, and making those borders between them. And then really giving some kind of what is called spiritual meaning for body practices, for instance. Seeing positive in a positive way regarding the body, giving it a value that wasn't there, I think, in Christian medieval and early modern culture. Maybe this really the globalization tendency, I think, of all of us, of tourism and cultural consumption and etc. So you can pick from many different cultures all those practices. This is something that the concept of spirituality enables, which the concept of religion didn't. You couldn't go to church and practice yoga. It was uncomfortable, I assume, in the early 20th century. Today, you can go to church and have a yoga practice. And exactly as you said, this is justified by using the term spirituality.
And I suspect as well that modern communications technology means that although people would have been doing heterodox practices, sometimes practices from outside, but sometimes folk kind of things, the degree to which we were aware that other people were doing them was limited.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you'd have to know somebody pretty well to know that they were actually also, you know, making charms or doing healings and these kind of things. Whereas now we know that everywhere, you know, it's vernacular and there's all sorts of heterodox things going on in every Christian. But when we didn't have those ways of communicating and all the knowledge was mandated from the church authorities, that wasn't the impression you would have got. So it's not only changed the degree to which these are available, it's changed the fact that we now know that it's been available and that everybody does it and it's fine. Yeah, you know, it's that kind of thing.
So
the idea of self, for instance, it's so central to our culture. Criticize it or not, you know, we're not in a communal culture anymore. And here, so the self, I think that's a wonderful expression. I think Paul Hillas hit the nail here with the self-spirituality. No, it's not a God spirituality, it's a self-spirituality. And let's say self is in the center, improvement, self-improvement, self-progress, etc. That's the core of core value of our society. Where I think, in a way, we're all part of it. I think similar things happen in the university. What happens in, you know, the whole concept of knowledge as something practical, it's something that improves our life. That's the most important thing. And that's exactly what spirituality offers people. A way of having something practical, doesn't take too much of your time, which is, you know, again, it's not necessarily negative.
Is it a bit like, is it a bit like having your cake and eating it? You know, that phrase where you kind of, you know, you can have the best of both worlds. You can at the level of personal, embodied and relational level, you can have something more than is vouchsafed by a purely, you know, secular materialist regime. But one does not have to go the whole hog. One does not have to go the whole way into a more developed or fully blown practice or identification. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think it's a bit too critical from my point of view. Because I'm trying to, you know.
Well, I mean it descriptively.
Eating the cake and not.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I think, I don't know, the difference between psychoanalysis and contemporary, you know, clinical psychology, which is much, you know, treatment. Again, I think it's the same direction. And it's not necessarily bad. You don't have the time or you don't have the justification of you know, digging into your past for hours on the sofa. That's something that was okay for certain people, of course, and quite limited to people in the early mid 20th century. Now today, people want to go to a session that will improve their mental or psychological, going for 3-4 times, you know, having some kind. And I think that's also what spirituality. You don't have to read the whole, you know, Hindu literature in order to do yoga.
Well, you know, in which case that fits neoliberalism quite well, because that's exactly so, you know, we're getting to increasing productivity and minimalizing work.
I think that's part of it. That's part of it. But again, it's not necessarily the same.
Okay. But in that case, what about the question of secularization? Because in one or two of your writings, you have suggested that there is some kind of pushback here or a reversing of the conditions of secularization, or a qualification, shall we say, of the conditions of secularization. But in fact, what you've just said would be used by strong secularization theorists to say, well, that's exactly it. You know, this is just a kind of a boost of secular conditions.
No, I think it's. I think secularization and religionization. We're speaking about secularization, but actually the interesting term, or another interesting, is religionization. Because the assumption that there is a process of secularization assumes that there was a state of religion, of religiosity, and then secularization came and started, you know, going forth and maybe now coming back. I see the process of secularization working in tandem with a process of religionization. These are two concepts that started in Western Europe in the early modern period and were applied to other cultures. It wasn't there before, neither religion nor secularity.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
Yes.
And then we have this process. And I think now we have a different process.
Right.
I think it's not that it's going back, or it's still in play, of course. Religionization, I think, is looking at things and saying, this is religion. And or looking at myself saying, I'm religion, so I'm behaving in such and such, I believe. That's the process of religionization, or secularization, the same thing.
Right.
This is secular, so it's supposed to have to behave like secular. I'm secular, so there are certain things I do and certain things I don't do. And I think that's not relevant to many people today. And you say, no, I'm not secular, I'm not religious, it's not relevant, I'm spiritual. And then they start doing things which are really a new kind of things, like yoga and going to church for sometimes and swimming and saying, wow, I have a spiritual experience now, and all those new things. So I don't see it as part of secularization. I see it really as something basically different.
So is it the case that just as people like Timothy Fitzgerald have argued that the religious and the secular are kind of co-constitutive, so secularization and religionization are kind of mutually generating each other, and what we have here is now a different kind of situation that has transcends that or has moved beyond that, those kinds of concerns.
Actually, I think that the spirituality actually corroborates and strengthens the position of Fitzgerald, McCutcheon, and Talal Asad, because it shows that not only in non-Western cultures or pre-modern cultures there was no concept of religion and secular. Also in our society, Western societies, they knew it. It didn't disappear, those concepts. I don't think they will disappear. But there's a new option which is neither secular nor religion. So I think that strengthens their point that it's not something universal.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on the sort of the situation in the field, in our field, rather than how do we move forward? How do we start to deal with this within religious studies?
Yeah. Good question. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, Boaz, and I know a bit about David, but I mean, teaching this material is an interesting challenge. And here, I mean, in many ways, this is a whole topic in itself. David has written and edited work on this, but we tend to still, in religious studies or the study of religions, we're very much constrained by a kind of very hegemonic model of religion as world religions, these big institutional blocks of things that are almost like, corporate institutions that are said to have these kinds of identities. And that really does constrain how you can insert this material into the curriculum to teach to students, because I do think, as well as theorizing this material and researching it, we need to be able to try and educate the next generation of students who will come and take our place so that we can get more work done on this. And I mean, it's not just an idle contemporary issue. I mean, one would say that the whole worlds of, what gets called the occult, what gets called esoteric, have been very, very important in the last couple of 100 years at least, but are scarcely researched at all, scarcely get the kind of the resources to work with them that, Judaism, the various Christianities, the various Judaisms get, So it's a real question about how we can bring to people's attention the significance of this stuff, working with such conservative paradigms of religion, which themselves have a product of the various conditions you're describing, So, I mean, I teach a course called New Spiritualities, and I've been beavering away at this course for years. I don't know if you do any teaching in this line about this material where you are, Boaz.
Yeah, well, I'm in a different position because I'm in a Department of Jewish Studies. But in a way similar, because also very conservative. I think not many departments of Jewish thought, but definitely I give courses on New Age Kabbalah, Contemporary Kabbalah, sometimes even larger on New Age, although that's complete, that's stepping the line because it's not even Jewish. But definitely I think it's good that we are doing it. I think that I received, when I started I received very negative reactions from some of my colleagues who really sneered at what you're not doing serious scholarship. What happened was you're a serious scholar. How come you leave manuscripts and go and study? But I think, slowly, that was 20 years ago, and I think our work is, I think it's changing, and people are much more open in the academia now to working and recognizing the significance of contemporary, whatever we would call it, spirituality or New Age or religiosity.
Yeah. Well, I do think the key there, in terms of the academic capital of a project, is to connect the debates with larger debates about religion and modernity, religion and secularization, consumption, political ideologies, economics, all that kind of thing. And I think when we start to do that, we find more colleagues taking us seriously, both in the field of various studies of religion, but outside of that, in cultural studies and sociology. Do you think that's the case too? Because you've always connected these things to wider processes.
And part of the problem is that there also hasn't been a lot of work on this kind of material from within the critical religion, approach. That's tended to focus more on historical genealogy, and we're now starting to get things like Aaron Hughes' work on Islam, for instance. But there still needs to be a focused project looking at the emergence of New Age spirituality, other alternative religious movements within the critical, history of the idea of religion and the category of religion. But absolutely, yes, that's how we need to establish the importance of what we're doing. And it'll also help us to move, because so much of that work is done from an insider perspective, unfortunately, which is it's a whole other conversation, but it's worth mentioning. Yes. But yeah, absolutely, I agree with what both of you are saying, and we just need to get enough of a foothold in the academy that we can actually do this work. And I think with hindsight, it'll be clear what the importance of it was.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's also a question of connecting, because I think there's more work done than we have. Sometimes, I meet someone, you're doing the same. I didn't know that you were working. So there's a group working on new religiosities in Turkey. Very interesting.
Right.
Quite a large group. Many of them francophones.
Right.
So maybe where there's less connections. Also the question of different academic cultures. Yeah. But there's people working on it in Morocco, and I think that's fascinating. So I think, I'm very happy to be here and meet you. Yeah. I think those connections between scholars who are working, sometimes they're in their own corners. Yes. That's also very important to put it.
Because of course there are no institutes or where we can do this work is the problem. Yeah.
No, I think that's really right. I mean, Jean-Francois Meyer, the Swiss scholar, put me onto a paper through his Religioscope Foundation about new spiritualities in Azerbaijan, for example. Very interesting paper, And then, as you say, there's Morocco, there's Turkey, but there's also new spiritualities in sort of Catholic contexts like Mexico as well.
Definitely.
So you're probably right.
South America is very interesting. There's a lot going on there.
Sure. So it's a question of connecting, and it's a connection of resources to do the connecting as well, of course, because in my view, academia doesn't free float. It's always dependent on money and institutional support.
Okay, well, that's a good point to end on. I think it's relatively positive, but realistic. So, thanks to you, Boaz, and to Steve, for this very stimulating conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview in particular, Chris. It would have been nice to get some of your thoughts at the time about particularly sort of Boaz's idea that the currency of spirituality in the public discourse on religion is due to it transcending the idea of religious and secular as separate spheres. Transcending's the wrong word. I mean, that's kind of, but that I particularly liked his idea that we talk about secularization, but that goes hand in hand with religionization, and that both of these processes of constructing this dualistic, what's the word? let's say
dualistic system.
Dialectic.
A dialectic, that's right. If they both fail, and then spirituality is something which isn't them, but partakes in the same thing. Yeah,
indeed. No. Yeah, and I often find myself repeating. It's actually a phrase from the Woodheads about religion having become a toxic brand in many contexts, and that the language of the spiritual sort of seems to capture a lot of what people see as all the nice bits that were associated with religion without any of the perceived negatives. And then also, we will be shown, as you discussed there, sort of these remarkable figures and everything about how many people identify as spiritual or participate in spiritual practices or see themselves in some way as spiritual. But I always think, well, what's the alternative there when these questions are asked? Are you materialistic? Are you superficial? And when it's framed in that kind of another dialectic, then the spiritual can seem, well, that's just being deep and considerate and nice to my fellow human.
Well, I mean, when I was doing research into New Age conspiracy groups, I actually asked them what spiritual meant, and they didn't give me the same answer. It could mean anything from truth, being yourself,
to psychological.
Yeah, it meant all sorts of things. And then every so often you'd get one who kept insisting it was spiritualism, and I had to, bite the scholarly part of my tongue not to correct them every time.
Exactly. So it is, as we've just discussed, it's a term that is remarkably slippery and contested, but is very, it has a lot of discursive power.
Talking about things with a lot of discursive power, next week's interview is by Jonathan Tuckett and Bettina Schmidt.
And they're talking about the experience, which is another...
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's another thing
that's a double link.
Yeah.
This was an episode that Jonathan did with video at the Open University's Contemporary Religion and Historical Perspective conference back in February. And this was based on Bettina's keynote, talking about some early figures in the study of religion, particularly sort of anthropological, phenomenological approach, but people who placed experience centrally. And she talks about the way that the aspects of their work that have influenced contemporary study, but also those that have been kind of forgotten. And Bettina's argument is that we should centralize claims of experience again in religious studies.
Excellent. Well, we know that will certainly pique the interest of a number of our regular listeners. And that's going to be our final podcast for the 2017-2018 academic year. And it's fitting that we're last week we had the outgoing BASR president. This week, we had the outgoing BASR president Steve Sutcliffe, and Bettina will be assuming the office of BASR president in Belfast in September. So fitting that they're sort of closing the academic year at the RSP.
Absolutely, and BASR, our longest and most faithful sponsor here, but also kind of our spiritual home. See, I've brought it back full circle.
Wonderful. And to you, listener, who've stuck with us right to the end of this podcast, thank you right there.
Yeah,
you
don't
personally.
Look around. We're talking to you.
Thank you for listening. Have a nice big hug.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our opportunities digest by Jana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget, you can support the project using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals.